Hey guys, I'm going to dive right into the lecture on the presidency. Be sure and be checking out the website that I have posted that has practice quizzes and things like that for you. It is a really helpful tool in addition to studying your text and my lectures. Stay tuned to the end of this lecture for an important announcement. But right now, I'm going to dive into the presidency. Actually, really quickly, next week, we are talking about the bureaucracy and the American legal systems and the courts. This week, we are only doing the presidency. So stay tuned. We'll get you through this, and then we'll have one more announcement. All right, so your chapter is a little bit dated, so I'm going to try to update it a little bit. But what talks about when President Trump came into office. When he won, he did not have a lot of faith from the Republican establishment, meaning like the folks who had been in office in D.C. prior to this. Very different when George W. Bush came into office. He had a very strong supporting of his Republican Party. Trump didn't have a strong mandate of voters and didn't have the strong support of a unified party, but he did have the unified Congress, and he didn't come in facing an opposition to party determined to thwart his agenda, which is exactly what Obama had for the beginning of his term, and which is exactly what President Biden has for the beginning of his term currently. Midterm loss, we've talked about that. We talked about that last class is what happens usually halfway through a presidency where they do not have both chambers anymore. But, when Obama came in, when Trump came in, when Biden has come in, they have had control of all three chambers, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Trump does share with the Republican Party, though, when he came into office, the eagerness to eliminate as much of Obama's legacy as possible. And same right now with President Biden wanting to overturn a lot of what Trump did. He can do this through things called executive actions. We saw this a ton when Biden came into office. Almost every week I was having to update folks on what executive actions had been signed that week. Obama took more than 60 since the 2014 State of the Union. There was a tension between Congress and the president that was intentionally built by the founders. Wondering, if the president is the most powerful person on the planet. Of course, Trump would have said that he was. But when anything significant happens, we look to our president to solve our problems now, right? We represent, and then we want the president to represent our nation in times of struggle and tragedy and in triumph. But the Constitution actually provides for a fairly weak executive. It's difficult for president to be both the head of government and the head of state. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. Most countries have those as two people. Plus, he needs to have the ability to get along with the other branches of government with whom they share power, and it makes this job very difficult to do well. Should the president represent the interests of the people who voted for him or of all Americans? I mean, that's a really tough question to think about. You want to serve your constituency, your people that voted for you, but you're also supposed to serve all of America. So when they were drafting the Constitution, the presidency was not a preoccupation with the framers of the Constitutional Convention. They were more concerned with the legislature having all the real political power, but the breakdown of the national government under the Articles of Confederation demonstrated the need for some form of central executive. The founders provided for an electoral college, which is a group of people who would be chosen by the states for the sole purpose of electing the president. They assumed he would be made they assumed this electoral college would be made of good citizens who would exercise care and good judgment in casting their ballots, who would not make post-election claims on him. And they also wanted to avoid the concentration of power that could be abused by a strong executive, as they had just learned with King George III. Many of the arguments we hear come from a stronger executive, and this comes from things like Hamilton's Federalist Number 70 that calls for a more energetic presidency. All right, so I alluded to this just a minute ago. Head of state versus head of government. A head of state, the president has to be both of these things. The head of state is the apolitical unifying role of the president as symbolic and a representative of the whole country. This is kind of what our founders had in mind when they did this, sitting at the top of this small executive branch, commanding the armed forces and representing the nation. In most countries, this is apolitical. Like in Great Britain, it's the Queen. The founders wanted the president to carry the dignity, but not the power of a monarch. George Washington even wanted him to bear the title, His High Mightiness, the President of the United States, the Protector of their Liberties. We weren't ready for such a pompous title, but we do put the president on a higher plane than other politicians. The president has to do other things as head of state, things like greet other heads of state, attend a state funeral, toss out the first baseball of the season, host the annual Easter egg roll on the White House lawn, which we actually got to go to a few times, and it's really neat. Console survivors of a national tragedy. The vice president, of course, can do some of these things, but sometimes only the president will do. And then in his job as head of government, this is sometimes conflicting. It's the political role of the president as leader of a political party and chief arbiter of who gets what resources. Because we have a system of checks and balances, the president also has a lot of political powers that are intended to keep the other branches in check. He runs the government, makes laws, functions as the head of a political party. This means some citizens win more than others, some lose, some get angry, all of which works against the unifying image of head of state. Countries like Great Britain have a second person in this role, like a prime minister, who is expected to be political and is a much more powerful executive than the president. Though this has changed a lot in this country since FDR's The New Deal. Some of the political requirements of the president's role as head of government necessarily undermine his unifying role of head of state. And the hyper-partisanship of Congress right now makes it even harder to bridge these conflicting roles. In the Constitution, it says the president is to be chosen by the Electoral College to serve 4-year terms. The number of terms was unlimited until 1951 after FDR's fourth term spurred a constitutional amendment to limit to 2 terms. You must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years old, and a resident for at least 14 years, succeeded by the vice president, and then the Constitution doesn't actually lay out a line of succession after that. But in 1947, Congress passed the Presidential Succession Act, which establishes the succession after the vice president. The 25th Amendment says the vice president can take over when either the president or vice president and a majority of the cabinet report to Congress that the president is unable to serve. You may remember this when President Trump got the coronavirus last year, whenever that was. I guess it was last year. And they were concerned they were going to have to invoke the 25th Amendment to have the vice president serve in his stead. He ended up getting better quickly and everything was fine. But that is invoked when they say that the president is unable to serve. The president can also be removed from office for reasons of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. This has been done a few times, right? Removal requires 2 steps. After an in-depth investigation, the House votes to impeach by a simple majority vote, which charges the president with a crime. Then in the Senate, the president is tried on the articles of impeachment and can be convicted by a 2/3 majority. So very rarely, almost all presidents, I'll say, have had articles of impeachment filed against them. The impeachment is a formal charge that the House, that the president or another member of the executive branch has committed acts of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which may or may not result in office. Only 3 presidents, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, were impeached, but none of them have been convicted. Johnson failed in the Senate by 1 vote. Clinton could not assemble a majority against him, and the same with Donald Trump. The power of impeachment is meant to be a check on the president, but it's often threatened for partisan purposes. Impeachment resolutions were filed against Ronald Reagan over the invasion of Grenada and the Iran-Contra affair. George H.W. Bush over the Iran-Contra affair. George W. Bush for a host of reasons, including the war in Iraq, not responding adequately to Hurricane Katrina. I mean, so the other party is constantly trying to come up with ways to file articles of impeachment against a president. Nixon, of course, would have been impeached in 1974, but he resigned before he actually had his trial in the Senate. The House Judiciary had passed the resolution. There were enough votes to pass the measure on the House floor and to gain conviction in the Senate. There was clear evidence in the form of conversations taped by the president himself that he had been directly involved in the cover-up of a burglary at the Democratic National Convention at the Watergate Hotel, and so he did resign. Impeachment is more of a political than a legal process, so it's really vague in the Constitution, and it can mean anything as long as a majority of the House and 2/3 of the Senate are willing to vote on them. Because the Constitution is so vague on presidential powers, it was able to be ratified by both those who wanted a strong executive power and those who did not. This vagueness has allowed powers of the president to expand over time without constitutional amendment. The presidential power falls into 3 areas: an executive authority to administer government, the legislative and judicial powers, and to check the other 2 branches. So the executive branch is laid out in Article 2, Section 1. says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. It does not exactly say what executive power entails, and a lot of presidents and scholars throughout history have really debated the extent of that. Section 3 says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, which is where a lot of that authority comes from. The president is the chief administrator of the nation's laws. It's his role as the head of the federal agencies and the person responsible for the implementation of national policy. So the president, with the approval of the majority of the Senate, appoints the heads of departments and will oversee the work of the implementation of what is known as the cabinet. It's his presidential advisor group selected by the president, made up of the vice president, the heads of the federal executive departments, and other high officials to whom the president elects to give cabinet status. He appoints more than 3,500 federal employees, cabinet, lower administration officers, federal judges, military officers. It puts the president at the top of a vast federal bureaucracy. But his power is limited because though he appoints them, he really can't fire a lot of them. We'll talk about that more next week. He also has a role as commander-in-chief. It's his role as the top officer of the country's military establishment. Congress has the power to declare war, but as the commander-in-chief, the president has the practical ability to wage war. These powers are meant to check each other, but usually provide for a battleground on the power of military operations. The president also is the chief foreign policy maker. He has the executive role as the primary shaper of relations with other nations. This is not spelled out in the Constitution, but the foundation is laid in the provision that the president negotiates treaties, which are formal agreements with other countries negotiated by the president and requiring 2/3 approval from the Senate. He also appoints ambassadors, receives ambassadors of other nations, and amounts to determining what nations the United States recognizes. A lot of foreign policy is made by the president through executive agreements, like I started talking about at the beginning of this lecture. And also through heads of state, conversations, executive agreements with heads of state, because treaty making is a really slow and cumbersome process. Executive agreements are presidential arrangements with other countries that create foreign policy without the need for Senate approval, and it's used a lot more frequently than a treaty. So what about his legislative powers? So he is head of the executive branch, and the Constitution gives him some legislative power to check Congress. One of these things is to, from time to time, give the Congress information necessary of the State of the Union, and which is the State of the Union address, right? It's a speech given annually by the president to a joint session of Congress and to the nation announcing the president's agenda. It's intended to be quite limited, but it's now a major statement of the president's agenda. The president has nominal power to convene Congress, and when there's a dispute about when to disband, he can adjourn it as well, but it's really rarely invoked nowadays. He also has a presidential veto, his authority to reject a bill passed by Congress that can only be overridden by 2/3 majority in each house. And that's a pretty powerful tool, legislative tool that he has. Vice president, of course, is the presiding officer in the Senate, which matters right now because we have a 50-50 split in the Senate. So the vice president is the tie-breaking vote. This is a major key to presidential legislative power. It happens rarely like we're having right now with the tie-breaking vote. But it's often an underappreciated legislative power. But right now it's very appreciated by the Democratic Party because they need that tie-breaking vote. The president does not have the constitutional power to make law, but this power has really grown. And then executive orders, which I've talked about a little bit. These are clarifications of congressional policy issued by a president and having the full force of law. He can issue these to clarify how a law passed by Congress is to be implemented by an agency. For example, JFK and LBJ had affirmative action programs that were executive orders. A lot of post-9/11 security measures were executive orders. They are almost always released at a higher rate at the beginning of a presidency, and then sometimes at the very end of a presidency. Sometimes they even issue a symbolic executive order on their first day of office. It's not a congressional-made law, so a new president can come in and reverse any of their predecessors' executive orders. A signing statement is a statement recorded along with signed legislation to clarify the president's understanding of the constitutionality of a bill. It's quasi-legislative. It can significantly increase the president's role as a policymaker here. All right, well, what about judicial powers? The president can have a tremendous long-term impact on the judiciary, but short-term, it's pretty meager what they can do in the short term. The continuing impact from nominating judges to the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, goes on for a really long time, right? It was very important, I know, to a lot of folks that Donald Trump be able to appoint as many conservative Supreme Court justices as possible, because that's a lifetime appointment. The political philosophies of individual judges influence significantly how they interpret the law, especially for a Supreme Court justice who is a final arbiter of a constitutional meaning. Since a judge does serve for life, like I just said, a presidential appointment has a long-lasting effect. The court is currently conservative because of appointments made by Reagan and Bush in the 80s and 90s. And then, of course, Donald Trump had a number as well. But it doesn't always turn out the way they wanted it to. Eisenhower appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren and Justice William Brennan, and they turned out to be way more liberal than he had anticipated. When he left the presidency, he was asked if he had any regrets as president, and he said yes, 2, and they're serving on the Supreme Court. So he thought they were going to be more conservative than they actually turned out to be. So it's a risk, when you do nominate someone for the Supreme Court. The Senate has to confirm these appointments, and they're usually approved with occasional exceptions. I talked about before maybe I didn't talk to you guys about this. So Brett Kavanaugh, yes, we talked about this. When he was nominated, it was a very controversial time. No, we talked about when Mitch McConnell blocked Obama's. I can't keep up. When Mitch McConnell blocked Obama's appointee, and then Trump was able to bring somebody in. Actually, Brett Kavanaugh is a different example of a Trump nominee who had some things come up in his background check of some things they possibly had done as a high school student. There was a very public Senate trial on this, and they did end up voting to confirm him. He is a Supreme Court justice right now. He actually has COVID right now. But that is an exception. Usually they are approved without exception. The Senate filibuster threat can cause the nominations to be held up and create a backlog of cases. Both parties try to play the game as they try to prevent undesired ideological shifts in the federal courts. Senatorial courtesy is the tradition of granting a senior senator of the president's party a lot of power in a federal judicial appointment in their home state. And then another power that the president has in the judiciary is in appointing the Solicitor General. This is the Justice Department officer who argues the government's cases before the Supreme Court. So that's the president's employee. It's the president's lawyer, essentially. The government is successful in litigation more than any other litigant. Imagine that, winning over two-thirds of its cases in the past 50 years. Another judicial power granted to the president is the pardoning power, of course, which is the president's authority to release or excuse a person from the legal penalties of a crime. It comes from the traditional power of the king as the court of last resort and a check on the courts. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon in hopes of healing a country rather than watching a national trial and backlash. Sometimes pardons are motivated by personal, political, or partisan considerations rather than as a check on the courts, and they're often seen as potential abuses of the public trust. Our presidency has really evolved. The presidency outlined in the Constitution is not the presidency of today. We kind of have a pre-1930s and a post-1930s. Traditional presidency was the founder's version of a very limited executive power. This survived for over 100 years with the exceptions that echoed Hamilton's call for a stronger executive. Washington expanded the presidential foreign policy powers, and Jefferson entered into the Louisiana Purchase. Andrew Jackson developed a role of president as a political leader, and Lincoln called up state militias to enlarge the army and use taxpayer money to pay for it. So we have continually increased the role of the president throughout history. Inherent powers are presidential powers implied but not stated explicitly in the Constitution. They had the duty to take care that laws be faithfully executed. Some, like Lincoln, took this to mean national security meant a broader presidential role. These powers are not listed in the Constitution, but they're implied by the powers that are granted and supported mostly by the Supreme Court. Now, post-1930s, we have what's called the modern presidency, which is a trend toward a higher degree of executive power since the 30s. It's still a work in progress, but the simple rural nature of life in the United States changed rapidly in the 150 years after its founding. The country grew westward and more industrialized, and then FDR's New Deal meant the size of government exploded and popular ideas about the government changed radically. The use of strong presidential power became an expectation of the modern president. Nothing prepared Americans for the calamity of the Great Depression. The economy went into a tailspin, unemployment soared. Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, said the government only had limited powers and responsibilities to deal with what was, he believed, a private economic crisis. There was no widespread presumption, as there is now, that the government is responsible for the state of the economy or for alleviating the economic suffering of its citizens. But FDR's 4 terms initiated an entirely new level of government activism. The government was, for the first time, assuming responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens on a substantial scale. FDR said he was waging war on the Depression, and he sought from Congress the powers that would be given to him if, in fact, we were invaded by a foreign enemy. So he put into place programs that greatly increased the size of the federal government and his budget. The number of civilians working for the federal government increased by 50% in his first 2 terms. The legacy of the New Deal is that Americans now look to the president and to their government to regulate our economy, to solve our social problems, to provide political inspiration. No president has had such a profound impact on how Americans live their lives today than FDR. His New Deal was followed by Truman's Fair Deal. Eisenhower was less activist. LBG had a Great Society deal. All of these did less than promise, but reinforced beliefs that Americans' beliefs that government and the president should make ambitious promises. Some presidents like Carter and Reagan and Clinton have promised to cut back the size of government, but few efforts have been successful there. There has been a philosophy behind what's called an imperial president, summed up by President Nixon years after his resignation as, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. But there's a battle over executive authority, whether or not the modern powers of the presidency reach imperial status. Things like Watergate and Vietnam has made it harder for a modern president to act. Congress, the media, and the courts are checking a president in the way they haven't done in the past. The media is now subjecting a president to closer scrutiny and become more aggressive in their White House coverage. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were determined to restore the luster and power of the office following the post-Watergate weakening of the office. Many of George W. Bush's early executive orders were determined to bolster presidential powers, as were his claims of executive privilege made by his administration. He used signing statements to reflect a strong commitment to the unitary executive. 9/11 provided Bush and Cheney with a strong and pervasive rationale for their desire to create a more muscular presidency. They had really high approvals after 9/11. So Congress didn't take him on. But after his re-election in 2004 and waning approval ratings were seen as vulnerable enough for Congress to criticize him seriously. Sorry, I had a thing pop up and got me off. Unlikely, the Bush-Cheney attempts to bulk up the executive will have lasting effect. We probably won't see that more muscular presidency like that forever. Obama struggled with this. He was on the record as supporting traditional checks and balances, but he really rejected the muscularity of a presidency. The Constitution hasn't been altered to give a president more power, which results in what's called an expectations gap that makes the job inherently challenging. This is the gap between popular expectations of what a modern president can and should do and their constitutional powers to get things done. So, to avoid failure, the president has to seek power beyond what they claim is explicitly granted in the Constitution and even beyond what they can claim as part of their inherent powers. They do have other ways to kind of come over this expectation gaps. They have the power to persuade. They have the ability to convince Congress and other political actors and the public to cooperate with the administration's agenda. The presidents vary in their ability to capitalize on political context, and they face as much on their ability to single-handedly change minds, but sometimes that's all it takes to get a lawmaker to go along with your agenda. A president can also vary in their ability to capitalize on the political context they face as much as their ability to single-handedly change minds either in Washington or in the country at large. They can also go public, which is the presidential strategy of appearing to the public on an issue, expecting that the public pressure will be brought to bear on other political actors. For example, a State of the Union address, a White House press conference, a trip to an international summit. They're going public on an issue. The simplest level of going public is just having the president take his case to the people. It's been able to, public appearances have gone up a lot in the era of a modern president. But only a popular president can use the strategy of going public effectively. So popularity ratings have become crucial to how successful a president can be. Since the 1930s, Gallup has been asking people if they approve of the president. This number varies from president to president, but the presidency also varies wildly within a single term. Ratings are often a political barometer. The higher they are, the more effective a president is with other political and economic actors. The lower they are, the harder the president finds to get people to go along. 3 factors can affect presidential popularity. First is the cycle effect. Second is the economy. And third is unifying or divisive current events. So the cycle effect. This is the predictable rise and fall of a president's popularity at different stages of a term of office. Most enter office with a really high rating, which is called the honeymoon period. It's the time following an election when a president's popularity is really high and congressional relations are likely to be productive. But they rise and fall throughout a president's presidency. The state of the economy. Since FDR, the government has taken on an active role in regulating our national economy, and every president promises economic prosperity, but the presidential power over the economy is quite limited, even though we hold the president responsible for our economic performance. George H.W. Bush lost re-election largely in part of the prolonged recession. Newsworthy events can also influence a presidential approval. They're judged by their response to events, even those beyond their control. Examples like the BP Gulf oil spill in 2010. They looked to Obama and his ratings took a hit as the oil continued to spill. But sometimes unifying events can help. Like after 9/11, George W. Bush was looked at with a kinder eye, and it was able to push through legislation that was already on his agenda, but now he had public support. President and the Congress usually define the nation's problems and possible solutions in different ways. They have different constituencies to please. The president has more and needs to take a wider view, and Congress has narrow constituents and can represent particular interests. So they don't always line up to wanting the same things. There is a legislative liaison, which is an executive personnel who works with members of Congress to secure their support in getting a president's legislation passed. Presidential candidates often run on being an outsider, and sometimes is successful. And sometimes when they are outsiders, they can have a little trouble with the dynamics of sharing powers. A divided government is the situation that exists when the political rule is split between 2 parties, one of which controls the White House and the other controls one or both of the houses of Congress. So usually after we have a midterm loss, so for example, next November, say Republicans take back the Senate. So now Biden does not control both chambers and the presidency. That's called a divided government. It's more difficult, obviously, for a president to be successful. Members of parties stand for different approaches and solutions to the nation's problems, liberal versus conservative, of course. And under a divided government, Congress tends to ignore what the president wants. The president's likely to veto what the opposition party in Congress offers. The president is not likely to succeed at getting his agenda met, especially so, for example, if next November both the House and Senate flip and we have a Republican-led House and Senate and a Democrat presidency. It's going to be really hard to get anything done. We tend to think of the presidency as one person, the single executive image, but the president is limited in what he can accomplish alone. Instead, he's over the presidency, the head of the executive branch. George Washington had no staff and a small cabinet of just 3 department heads, but today there's a cabinet composed of 15 departments. Also the executive office of the president and the White House staff. They require a vast bureaucracy. The cabinet has each department in the executive branch headed by a presidential appointee, which collectively appoints the president's cabinet. 15 agencies heads. This is not explicitly set up in the Constitution, but the founders were aware that the president would need advisors. Washington's 3 were a Secretary of State, Treasury, and War, which is now called Defense. Cabinet appointees are to serve a presidential political goal, but the president does it in different ways. Like a Democrat may choose a labor leader for Secretary of Labor. A Republican would choose someone for the business community. So they have different ways of going about who they're nominating. They also have the Executive Office of the President. We call it the EEOB, the Eisenhower Executive Office building where they are housed. This is where a lot of people who work for the president work in this building. It's huge. Next door to the White House. It's a collection of 9 organizations that help the president with his executive policy and political objectives. Within that is the Office of Management and Budget, which is the organization within the EOP that oversees the budgets and departments from agencies. The director works to ensure that the presidential budget reflects his own policy agenda. Council of Economic Advisors is the organization within the EOP that advises the president on economic matters. The National Security Council is the organization within the EOP that provides foreign policy advice to the president. They give him daily updates about events around the world. Now you have your actual White House staff. This is more than 400 employees within the executive office of the president who work most closely and directly with the presidency. They actually have offices in the White House, not the EEOB, and their appointments do not have to be confirmed by the Senate. FDR had about 60 employees. In 2013, there were about 460 employees in the White House. They have 3 functions: policymaking and coordination, outreach and communications, and then internal coordination. So the person in charge is their chief of staff. It's the person who oversees the operations of all White House staff and controls access to the president. The vice president, of course, for most of history, vice presidents haven't been important actors in the presidential administrations. Originally, the vice president was offered to the second place presidential candidate. So they were seen as potential rivals and excluded from most decisions. Can you imagine if that's what the vice president was now? This was corrected, of course, by the 12th Amendment in 1804, which provided for electors to select both the president and the vice president. The vice president typically balances out the president, both geographically, experience-wise, and policy-wise. A lot of vice presidents find it a good launching pad for a presidential bid, including our current president, Joe Biden, who was Obama's vice president. The office of the first spouse, the office of the first lady, is in tremendous flux. Even the term, there's no way to check the influence of the first spouse. It's often a national commentary on how women in general should behave. Rosalind Carter attended Jimmy Carter's cabinet meetings at his request. Hillary Clinton went to go work to finance their lifestyle while Bill served as governor, and then she was elected senator after his presidency ended. Then she ran for president, became Obama's Secretary of State, and ran for president again. It's different ways of doing things. Almost all of the first ladies have an agenda, like Lady Bird Johnson supported highway beautification. Nancy Reagan, famously with her Just Say No to Drugs. Laura Bush worked on education, youth, and literacy. Michelle Obama focused on health and nutrition. Most presidents have a giant ambition and large egos, right? They're classified on 2 levels. Their energy level, are they passive or active? And their orientation toward life, are they positive or negative? Of course, the best and most popular presidents are usually active positives. FDR, JFK, Clinton, and Obama. Some passive positives would be Reagan and George W. Bush. An active negative would be Richard Nixon. Where do we think Trump falls? Is he, I think probably active energy, but orientation toward life, positive or negative? I'm honestly not sure. What about President Biden? I would say his energy level is a little more passive, and orientation toward life is probably a little more positive. His presidential style, the image of projected by the president that represents how he or she would like to be perceived at home and abroad. Truman was known for being a straight and profane, no-nonsense decision-making. Eisenhower was known as the victorious general, as a statesman above the fray of petty day-to-day politics. JFK invoked this theme of getting the country moving again, embodied this with this youth and energy. Reagan had this grandfatherly, optimistic presence. Clinton felt America's pain. George W. Bush was perceived as a non-intellectual who would joke that C students could grow up to be president. He was interested in results, not academic debates, and perceived to be more moral than Clinton. Obama was even-keeled and introverted. No drama Obama. Though we may never meet the president, we now know him more intimately through the television than they have in years past. How do you think a president's behavior would change if we once again allowed a president to serve more than 2 terms? Do you think it would? think that's something to think about, how we look at FDR for being such an important figure in changing the presidency. But after that, nobody was allowed to serve that many terms anymore. All right, thanks for hanging in with me today. We are not going to have a quiz this week, but I'm still going to count it as though everybody got 100. I know having an online course is tricky. Please email me if you have any questions, but go ahead and count your 100 for quiz 2, and we will be back next week with 2 more lectures. So I'll talk to you then. Bye.